Liberal journalists thought he had the upper hand against Caroline Leavitt until she completely flipped the script on him. The studio lights shone brightly, reflecting off the sleek black desk where Bryce Langford sat, meticulously scanning his notes for the third time. He wasn't just any journalist. He was a seasoned pro, known for his relentless questioning and ability to make even the most polished politicians falter. His reputation was built on exposing inconsistencies, dismantling talking points, and leaving his guests scrambling. And tonight, his target was Caroline Leavitt. She had been making headlines, a young, confident conservative who seemed unshaken by the relentless scrutiny of the press. To Bryce, she was an opportunity, a chance to prove, once again, that right-wing rhetoric crumbled under real journalistic pressure. His producers had armed him with everything: clips of past interviews, social media posts, every position she had taken. His game plan was set: challenge her policies, corner her on social issues, push until she tripped over her own words. It had worked before. The control room was buzzing. Producers adjusted camera angles, a floor manager signaled the countdown, and a makeup artist dabbed the last shine off Bryce's forehead. He barely noticed. His attention was locked on the empty chair across from him, the one Caroline would soon fill. "She's not ready for this," he murmured, twirling his pen. "She's never faced someone like me." A deep breath. The intro music played, signaling the start of the segment. The screen behind him displayed the bold title, Exposing the Right, an unscripted interview with Caroline Leavitt. The camera light blinked red. It was showtime. But the moment Caroline Leavitt stepped onto the set, something shifted. Bryce had expected nerves, a moment of hesitation, a rigid posture betraying her anxiety. Instead, she moved with a calm, self-assured confidence that caught him off guard. Shoulders squared, head held high, she slid into her chair with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. No fidgeting, no darting glances at the cameras. She simply nodded politely, crossed her legs, and rested her hands on the table, waiting. Bryce's signature smirk faltered, just for a second before he recovered. He was still in control. "Caroline, thanks for being here," he began, his tone measured and professional. "Thanks for having me, Bryce," she replied smoothly, her expression unreadable. The producers had lined up a segment full of tough, strategic questions, each designed to put her on the defensive. Bryce wasted no time. "You've positioned yourself as a fresh voice in conservative politics," he started, glancing at his notes. "But many critics argue that you're simply repackaging old ideas with a younger face. How do you respond to those who say you're just carrying water for the same Republican establishment?" A classic opening move. Paint her as a puppet. Force her to prove otherwise. Make her scramble. But Caroline didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly as if she had already anticipated the question. "It's interesting," she said, "that when young progressives rise in politics, they're called trailblazers. But when a young conservative does, they're accused of being a mouthpiece. Seems like a bit of a double standard, don't you think?" Her response was quick, precise. Bryce hesitated for just a fraction of a second. He wasn't used to being thrown off balance this early. He adjusted, recalibrated. "Keep pressing." "That's not what I'm saying," he countered smoothly. "But let's talk policy. You've been vocal in your opposition to progressive economic reforms, yet polls show many young voters support them. Why should they listen to someone arguing against policies they believe will help them?" It was a trap. Make her seem out of touch with her own generation. But again, she didn't flinch. "Young people don't just support ideas because they sound good," she said, leaning forward slightly. "They support what actually works. And if you look at the states that have implemented these so-called solutions, you'll see rising costs of living, businesses fleeing, and fewer job opportunities. Young Americans deserve real solutions, not just feel-good slogans." Bryce tightened his grip on his pen. The audience couldn't see it, but he could feel control slipping. Not completely, but enough to be noticeable. He glanced at his screen. The live chat was flooding with comments. Some were on his side, but others were agreeing with her. That was a problem. She wasn't supposed to be winning people over. Bryce forced a tight smile, a practiced move to mask his miscalculation. He had faced tough interviewees before, But something about Caroline's approach was different. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't scrambling. She was in control. Fine. Time to turn up the heat. Let's be honest. Bryce leaned forward, voice steady but pointed. Your party has struggled with young voters. A majority reject conservative policies on climate change, healthcare, and social justice. When you speak, aren't you just addressing a shrinking audience? The phrasing was deliberate. Corner her, force her to admit defeat. But she didn't miss a beat. Bryce, if we're being honest, then let's actually be honest, she shot back, her tone firm but composed. Young people aren't rejecting conservative values. They're rejecting a version of conservatism that hasn't been properly explained to them. If all they ever hear is a media narrative that paints one side as heroes and the other as villains, of course they'll lean left. The issue isn't the message, it's the messengers. The way she delivered that last line, controlled, deliberate, made Bryce shift in his seat. She wasn't just answering his questions, she was taking control of the conversation. Still, he wasn't ready to give up ground. Time to make it personal. Some have accused your rhetoric of being divisive, he said, adopting an air of concern. You've called out certain media outlets as activists pretending to be journalists. Do you think that kind of language helps bring people together? Or are you just feeding into the very partisanship that's tearing this country apart? A setup. Paint her as the problem. Make her justify herself. But she only smiled. Small, knowing. It's interesting, Bryce, she said, that when conservatives call out media bias, it's labeled divisive. But when the media runs hit pieces full of anonymous sources and half-truths, it's called investigative journalism. If people have lost trust in the press, maybe the press should take some responsibility for that. Bryce exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. He had seen politicians dodge, deflect, pivot, but this was different. Caroline wasn't dodging, she was counterpunching, and the audience could see it. His earpiece crackled, a producer's urgent whisper, "Stay on offense." But it was too late. The dynamic had shifted. The interview that was supposed to expose Caroline Leavitt had instead become a moment that exposed something else. Something about the media, about public trust, about the game people were tired of watching. And Bryce Langford had just become the latest example of why.